Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Africa Facts Corner podcast. This is podcast where we talk about Africa general history, including pre-colonial and post-colonial African histories. We talk about the culture and traditions in Africa, African civilization, pre-colonial and post-colonial great African leaders, and we talk about exciting news about Africa. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about a very important topic, a topic that's important to African, whether in at home or in diaspora, which is transatlantic slave trade. We are going to be giving you some historical background to this slave trade and recent issues that have come up in the news about transatlantic slave trade. And we're also going to be talking about some of the African countries that retained their colonial names, the names given to them by their colonial masters. So my name is Gideon Oguniye. I'm your host on Africa Fat Corner podcast. And I have with 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans for use as enslaved laborers on their sugar plantations in Cape Verde, which is a country in Africa. So when you are talking about transatlantic slave trade, it's a segment of this global slave trade that transported between 10 million to 12 million enslaved Africans across the transatlantic ocean to the Americans to work in plantations. And these events happened between the 16th century to the 19th century. So it was a second of the three stages of the so-called triangular trade, in which textile wines were shipped from Europe to Africa, enslaved people were shipped from Africa to the Americas to work in the plantation, sugar and coffee were shipped from Americans to Europe, so as laborers. And then we have the Spanish, who also joined the trade, and they took Africans to the Caribbeans in the 1500s, but the Portuguese merchants continued to dominate transatlantic slave trade for another century and a half, operating their bases in Congo, Angola area along the west coast of Africa, and they were operating in places like Lagos in Nigeria, and then they were dominant transatlantic slave trade for about 150 years. Now, the Dutch, the Netherlands, became the foremost traders of enslaved people during parts of the 1600s. And in the following century, we have the English and French merchants control about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa between Senegal and Niger rivers, and then by 1713, an agreement between Spain and Britain granted the British a monopoly on the trade of enslaved people from Africa. So under the Ascencio de Negros, Britain was entitled to supply those colonies, all their colonies, with 4,800 enslaved Africans per year, and they did that for about 30 years. Slave trade. So the contract was signed for the supply to the South Sea Company, of which British Queen Anne had about 22.5% of the stock. So probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americans before 1600. Just a few 100,000 Africans were taken. But in the 17th century, however, demand for enslaved people from Africa rose sharply with growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in North America. The demand for slaves from Africa rose sharply. So the largest number of enslaved people were taken to the Americans during the 18th century, when, according to historians, estimates about 3/5 of the total volume of transatlantic slave trade took place in this century, 18th century. People enslaved in Africa and transported over the ocean to the Americans to work in the plantation. So, slave trade has so many devastating effects on Africa. It has economic effects in the sense that the people that were taken as slaves, they were in their productive years and they were taken to go and work as laborers in faraway Americas and in the Caribbeans, in Brazil, in some part of North America, and so on and so forth. So what does this mean? It means the population for Africa, because you are taking a huge number of their population to go and work elsewhere. It also means that there's this fear of captivity in Africa, which have impacts on their economic and agricultural development. When a large percentage of people taken were women in their childbearing years, and young men who normally would have been starting families were people that were taken as slaves to the Americans. The European enslavers usually left behind people who are elderly, disabled, people that are dependent on other people. And these are people that were least able to contribute to the economic health of their society. So the ones that have the power to contribute to the economic health of their societies were taken as slaves, and that this is just to make a summary of some of the economic impact of slave trade on the whole thing. But another thing that I think we really need to talk about is the brutality, the kind of treatment that we're giving to these enslaved people. I've said that this trade has damning economic impact on Africa, but let's talk about the kind of treatment that was meted on the people that were enslaved. So the Atlantic Passage or Middle Passage, usually to Brazil or an island in the Caribbean, was notorious for its brutality and for the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions on slave ships, in which hundreds of Africans were packed tightly into tiers below decks for a voyage of about 5,000 miles, 8,000 kilometers, that could last sometimes weeks, or that could last from a few weeks to several months. So they were usually typically chained together. The historians estimate that between 15 to 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americans died aboard slaved ships. So this is also like a summary of this kind of suffering that people that were captured, enslaved, went through. So if you want to really see the graphical go through, but recently there have been conversations around whether the West is morally bound to pay reparations to affected countries that are affected by slave trade, and this conversation has been ongoing, and that's one of the reasons why we are. That's one of the important points we are going to be talking about on this podcast. This thing happened for over 450 years. So we are talking about something that happened for 4.5 centuries. The question of whether reparations should be paid to the continent of Africa for the transatlantic slave trade is still being debated as we speak. So the leaders in the Caribbeans, they are saying that in their communique, in their final communique, they are saying that reparations need to be paid to the affected countries by Africa. So let me bring you in, Samuel. I've sort of tried to give some sort of historical background of transatlantic slave trade, the affected countries, and what this was all about. On this topic of whether reparations should be paid to Africans, Caribbeans, and other affected countries by slave trade, what is your opinion?
Doctor, while you were reading the summary of what happened during the slave trade, I was so sad. It was an horrible experience to recall. The incident was a bad one to actually bring back to memory, even when you check about everything that happened to those people that was actually taken to America and Britain to work. It's really, really pathetic. But looking at the demands of the Commonwealth community in the last conference held at Samoa, they raised concern again about reparation. And many people have been saying a lot of things about why the reparation should be paid and why not the reparation should be paid. Firstly, we need to understand that it is a very hard decision from the Britain, which you said last week that they will still visit this matter again, whether they were still going to pay but it may not be now. But my own take concerning all these issues is that reparation should be paid. Reparation should be paid to Africa. But why I am in support that reparation should be paid, I am also not in full support that it should be paid in cash. I am not in full support that it should be paid in cash, because if they are to pay it in cash, I will say to who? To who leaders are they going to give this reparation fee? Is it to the leader in Ghana, or they will distribute it among the African leaders? I will not fully support that, knowing fully well that African leaders cannot be trusted with the tiny thing because of their selfish interests that have bedeviled each of them in every sector and every sections that find themselves in the government. I will say that if Britain will be given a reparation, it should be in kind. Infrastructural development to Africans, investment in education, investment in agriculture, investment in health. They should help Africans to live standard in their own land and not in any way giving in cash to any African leaders.
Yeah, thank you very much for those important points, Samuel. Let me add that in 2005, there was a document, a 2005 United Nations document discusses different aspects of these reparations, including apologies from the West for past harms on Africa, the right to know the truth, which can also be a form of reparation, and also financial compensation. So the debate about whether reparation should be paid is not just about financial compensation alone. It's also talking about apology, also talking about the right to know the truth. So we should have a clear historical documentation of what happened during the transatlantic slave trade. So over the past 15 years, this debate has been ongoing. I've seen some West leaders like former British Prime Minister Tony Blair issued an apology for the role that the Britain played, the British people, the British played in transatlantic slave trade. We've seen some other British leaders like Rishi Sunak refusing to apologize, and the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying that we should forget about the past, we should look forward, and that the discussion around slave trade is not interested in engaging those discussions, and that is more interested in contemporary issues like issue of climate change and so on and so forth. So I sort of agree with your points that when we talk about reparations, it has to be well defined. We're talking about financial compensation to corrupt regimes in Africa, to corrupt regimes in the Caribbeans, and who should even pay this reparation? I think we need to broaden the conversation around this reparation. What does it mean, and who should pay? So we want to see your comments in the comment section. Please do follow us on Facebook, Africa Facts Corner, on Facebook, Africa Facts Corner on YouTube, and look for us on TikTok. And you can also follow our blog to see some exciting news and articles, blog articles about Africa. www.fatcorner.org. Another issue that I think we need to quickly talk about, maybe in the next 2 minutes, is the issue of countries that refuse to change their colonial name.